Hey there, friend. Tonight, we're slipping back in time to the muddy paths and quiet hearths of the medieval countryside. You won't find kings or knights in shining armor here, just ordinary people living quietly through plagues, famine, and the heavy rule of their lords. It's always such a peaceful joy to see our little global community gathering here, people from all walks of life, curled up with a blanket, a tea, or just their thoughts, ready to drift into history. And hey, if you find comfort in these quiet tales and slow storytelling, go ahead and tap that subscribe button only if it feels right. There's always more to explore, more stories to tell, and you're warmly invited to be part of it. Now, take a deep breath, dim the lights, silence the noise, and let's begin tonight's gentle wander through the pages of the past. You're exactly where you're meant to be. Welcome back. You're always safe here. Before the sun fully rises, before the rooster crows, there is a soft stillness in the peasant's cottage. The room is dark, save for the faintest light slipping through the cracks in the wooden shutters. Outside, the world is cool and quiet, wrapped in mist. Inside, a family begins to stir beneath blankets of rough wool and straw. The cottage is small, built with wooden beams and walls made of mud and straw. The roof is thatched, thick and brown, sheltering the family from rain and wind. There's only one room. Everything happens here: sleeping, cooking, working, praying. The floor is packed dirt, cold on bare feet. A fire, now only glowing embers, rests in the center of the room. It was kept alive through the night to keep out the chill. Children wake first, rubbing their eyes and stretching under scratchy blankets. A dog snoozes in the corner, tail twitching. The mother rises quietly, careful not to wake the baby. She moves slowly to the hearth, adding small sticks to the fire until it begins to crackle gently again. The father follows soon after, already thinking of the fields. No clocks, no alarms, only the rhythm of light and sound, the birds outside, the first rays of morning. Life begins early because there is much to do and only so much daylight. Yet the pace is slow, calm, and familiar. A wooden bowl is passed. Water is scooped from a bucket. Everyone rinses their face with a splash. There is no rush. Only the beginning of another day, just like the one before and the one before that. A life of repetition, yes, but also one of quiet strength. The day has begun under the same roof on the same soil as always. The fire is glowing a little brighter now. Warmth spreads through the small cottage, and a soft light dances on the walls. Outside, the mist still hangs low, clinging to the fields and fences. But inside, the day is quietly beginning. It's time for breakfaster, as they called it then, breaking the fast. There is no table full of choices, no plates piled high, just one pot warmed again over the fire. Inside, a thick stew called pottage made from oats, beans, or barley, whatever was left over from the day before. It smells earthy and plain, but it's filling and warm. A wooden ladle dips into the pot, and each family member gets a share. The bowls are handmade, chipped around the edges. Each spoonful is eaten slowly. There is no talking, just quiet chewing, the sound of the fire, and the occasional sniffle from the cold air still hanging around. Some days, if the garden gave enough, there might be chopped onions, garlic, or leeks stirred in. If they were lucky, maybe even a bit of cheese left from last week's milk. But most days, it's just what they have. Bread, if there's any, is tough and dark, made from rye or barley, not soft white flour. It must be soaked in the pottage to chew it. The drink? Water from the well, or more often a weak ale barely fermented, just enough to be safer than the water. Children drank it too. It was part of life. There's no hurry, no rush to leave for school or shops, just the slow, steady start of a long day. The meal is simple, shared, and quiet. And as bowls are emptied and hands are wiped, the family prepares to step outside into the waiting fields. After breakfast, the day truly begins. The air outside is still cool. The sun is rising slowly, spilling pale light across the fields. Dew sparkles on the grass. Insects buzz gently. It's peaceful for now. The peasants walk down worn dirt paths, boots thick with yesterday's mud. They carry wooden tools, rakes, sickles, and simple spades. Some lead-tired oxen, their heads low and slow, pulling wooden plows behind them. These aren't their own fields, not really. The land belongs to the Lord. Each family is given narrow strips of land to work. Not one big plot, but many small ones scattered across the village fields. One here, another far over there. It's meant to keep things fair, but it also means more walking, more time lost. The work is hard, but not fast. There is no rushing. The soil must be turned by hand or by plow. Seeds are planted slowly, carefully, often by a bent back and weathered hands. No machines. No shortcuts, just rhythm and repetition. Men, women, and even children help. Everyone has a job. Weeding, planting, watching the animals. The youngest ones pick up stones from the dirt. The older ones guide the oxen. They aren't working for wealth. They are working because they have to. The Lord expects his share. A certain number of days each week must be spent in his service, plowing his fields, harvesting his grain. This is called labor duty, and it cannot be refused. Still, there's a strange comfort in it. The air is fresh, the pace is steady. Birds call from the trees, and though the work is tiring, there is also pride in doing what needs to be done. As the sun rises higher, the peasants continue on, one foot in front of the other, field after field. Not far from the village field stands the manor house. It sits on a small rise, built of stone, with a wooden gate and tall hedges. Compared to the cottages below, it looks grand and strong. Not large by modern standards, but to the peasants, it feels like a castle. This is where the Lord lives. Most peasants will never step inside the manor. Some will never even speak to the Lord himself, but still his presence is always felt like a quiet shadow stretched over the land. The manor watches. It listens. It rules. The Lord owns the land. Every furrow, every pasture, every tree belongs to him. The peasants live on his land, work his fields, and give him a share of everything they grow. This is the system called feudalism. A long word for a simple idea. The Lord gives protection and the peasants give labor. Sometimes the Lord is fair, sometimes not. It depends on the man. But either way, his word is law. The manor is more than just a home. It's where decisions are made. It's where rents are collected and disputes are settled. If two peasants argue over a boundary or a stolen chicken, they must go to the Lord or his steward. Punishments can be small or fine, a task or harsh. The manor also holds a granary, a small chapel, maybe a dovecote full of birds. Servants work there, and sometimes cooks and scribes. But to the village below, it is mostly a place of power. Distant, quiet, always watching. The peasants pass the manor each day. They bow their heads. They speak little. Not out of fear exactly, but out of habit. Because in the end, it is not their name carved in stone above the gate. It is his. At the heart of nearly every medieval village, there stood a small church. It was often the oldest building in the area, built of stone, with a wooden roof, and sometimes a crooked little bell tower. The bell didn't ring often, but when it did, it echoed across the fields, calling everyone to gather. The church wasn't just a place for prayer. It was the center of village life. Inside, It was cool and quiet. The walls were plain, maybe painted with faded pictures of saints and angels. The windows were small and let in little light. Candles flickered gently in the corners. The air smelled of wax, wood, and old stone. Most peasants couldn't read or write. The priest read from the Bible in Latin, a language they didn't understand. But still, they listened. The rhythm of the words was familiar, calming. The people knelt, crossed themselves, and murmured simple prayers they had learned by heart. Every week they came here, on Sundays for Mass, on holy days for special services. Babies were baptized here, couples were married here, the dead were blessed here, and buried in the ground just outside. The church taught them how to live, when to fast, when to feast, when to work, and when to rest. It gave them a calendar made not of months and numbers, but of saints' names and sacred days. Sometimes a traveling monk would visit, sharing stories of faraway places. But most days, it was just the village priest, quiet, patient, and steady. He was a part of the village, just like the blacksmith or the miller. To the peasants, the church was not a grand place, but it was holy ground, a place of comfort, a place to find peace. Even in a world full of hardship, the church gave them something to hold on to. Life for a medieval peasant was full of work-long days in the field, heavy tasks at home. But every so often there came a break, a special day, a feast day. Feast days were not just about food. They were days set aside to honor saintly men and women remembered for their goodness, their miracles, or their suffering. Names like Saint Bridget, Saint Cuthbert, or Saint Nicholas filled the village calendar. On these days, the bell in the church would ring early. People would gather in their best tunics, freshly washed if possible, with their hair combed and faces clean, would gather in their best tunics, freshly washed if possible, with their hair combed and faces clean. The church would fill with a smell of candles and flowers. The priest would speak of the saint's life of kindness, sacrifice, and sometimes miracles. Even if the peasants didn't understand every word, they listened quietly. It felt good to pause. And after the prayers, there was joy. Work stopped. Tools were set aside. Children laughed. Neighbors shared simple treats, flatbread sweetened with honey, roasted onions, bits of dried fruit. If there was a bit of extra grain or a freshly butchered animal, there might be stew for everyone. No one had much, but on feast days, they shared what they could. Some feast days had games, singing, dancing, the sound of a flute or drum. People told stories around the fire, passed down from their grandparents. Laughter filled the evening air. For a little while, life felt lighter. These days reminded the peasants that life wasn't only about surviving. There were moments, brief but beautiful, where community came first, where memory and hope were stronger than hardship. As the stars came out and the fire crackled low, the villagers would return to their homes, full from food, song, and silence. Tomorrow would be hard again, but tonight had been a gift. Not all of a peasant's work happened in the fields. Much of it took place at home, in the soft light of the hearth, where quiet hands worked slowly, steadily, and with care. Inside the cottage, after the morning's labor, or on rainy days, the home became a place of simple industry. There were no factories, no machines, only tools made by hand, and tasks passed down through generations. In one corner, a woman might sit at a small loom, weaving wool into cloth. The wool came from village sheep sheared, cleaned, and spun into yarn with a drop spindle. The weaving was slow, but each tug of thread brought the cloth to life. Patterns were plain but practical. Browns, grays, faded blues colors made from plants and roots. Nearby, the fire crackled gently in the hearth. A large black pot hung over it, filled with stew or porridge, stirred now and then with a wooden spoon. The fire was the heart of the home. It gave light, heat, and cooked every meal. Ashes were cleaned daily. Sparks were watched carefully. A house fire could mean disaster. Children played quietly nearby, with dolls made of scraps or carved wooden animals. As they played, they watched, they learned. One day, they too would spin, stir, sew, and tend. Other tasks filled the room: patching worn tunics, sharpening tools, making soap from ashes and fat, drying herbs hung from beams. The cottage was always busy in its own quiet way. These were not grand tasks. They were daily, humble, and necessary. And though the world outside was full of hardship, inside the home there was rhythm, there was purpose, there was warmth. And as the sun dipped low beyond the fields, the loom clicked, the stew simmered, and the hearth glowed on. In the Middle Ages, peasants didn't own many clothes. Most had just one outfit for daily use, and maybe a second one carefully folded away for church or feast days. There were no closets or drawers. Garments were stored in wooden chests, or simply hung on a hook beside the hearth. Clothing was made to last. A tunic for the men, often reaching the knees, worn over simple trousers tied with a rope or belt. Women wore long woolen dresses with aprons and sometimes a cloth cap or shawl for warmth. Children dressed much like their parents, just in smaller versions. As they grew, garments were let out, patched, or passed down to younger siblings. The fabric was coarse and heavy, usually wool, since it was warm, common, and came from the sheep they raised nearby. Linen, made from flax, was cooler and used for underclothes if the family could afford it. The colors were dull but natural grays: browns, faded greens dyed with things like bark, onion skins, or berries. Shoes were made of thick leather, tied with strips of hide. They didn't last long. On many days, especially in summer, people simply went barefoot, their feet tough from years of walking on soil and stone. If clothes tore, they were mended. If they wore thin, they were patched. A good seamstress could keep a tunic alive for many winters. Buttons were rare. Clothes were tied with cords or fastened with wooden pins. There were no mirrors in most homes, no need for fashion or decoration. Clothing was about protection, warmth, and work. But even in these plain garments, there was dignity. Each thread was a reminder of hands that spun it, feet that wore it, and the quiet strength of a life lived simply. In a medieval village, children were always near. You'd see them darting between the cottages, peeking out from behind their mothers, or toddling after goats in the yard. Their lives were not separate from the adults. They were part of the same rhythm, the same work, the same world. There was no school, not for most. A few children of the wealthier villagers might learn to read or write from a priest, but for peasant children, learning came by watching. A girl learned to spin wool by watching her mother's hands. A boy learned to guide the plow by walking beside his father. Lessons were not written down, they were lived. Children had chores from a young age. They fetched water from the stream in small clay jugs. They helped gather eggs, pick herbs, or scare birds from the grain. They carried bundles of firewood back to the house. It was work. Yes, but it was their way of belonging. But not every moment was labor. There was time for play, too. They made simple toys, wooden dolls, straw animals, hoops and whistles. Sometimes they played games with stones or sang songs while skipping. They chased each other through the meadows, laughing loudly until their mothers called them in for supper. There were no birthdays with candles, no wrapped gifts, but there was joy in small things: a sweet berry picked from the hedge, a warm place by the fire, or the feeling of a new pair of woolen socks. They were not shielded from the world's hardships. They saw sickness, They knew hunger, but childhood, even then, had its magic. And at the end of the day, when work was done and the hearth was glowing, they curled up close listening to stories told in low voices, falling asleep to the sound of familiar footsteps and crackling flames. Every year there came a time the villagers knew too well. It was called the lean season. Those quiet, colder months when the food stores began to shrink and every meal became a careful decision. It often started in late winter, just before the new crops could grow. By then, the grain harvested in autumn had been counted, measured, and slowly eaten. The last few turnips were spotted with soft patches. The onions hung from the beams were small and sprouting. Dried beans kept in sacks near the hearth rattled like empty hope. Hunger came slowly, not like a storm, but like a creeping fog. Each day the pot held a little less. Bread was stretched thinner. A bowl of pottage might be shared between more mouths than before. The children grew quiet. The old ones grew thinner. Mothers fed others before themselves. Some would dig for roots in the forest, hoping to find something edible in nettles, acorns, or wild garlic. Others bartered with neighbors, trading cloth or candles for a small bit of flour or a piece of dried meat. In bad years, it wasn't just hunger, it was famine. Crops might fail from too much rain or not enough. A sickness might strike the livestock, and then the suffering deepened. Yet, through it all, they endured. They knew how to make a small meal stretch. They boiled bones for broth, dried herbs to flavor thin soup, and ground old grains into flat cakes. They prayed, and they waited. Because even in the darkest months, spring was promised. The thaw would come. The fields would be planted again. Green shoots would rise. The lean months were long and quiet, but they always ended. And when they did, the taste of the first new onion, the first fresh egg, was sweeter than any feast. At first, it was just a whisper, a story told by a traveler. A sickness, they said, was moving across the land. People were dying quickly, without warning. Entire towns left silent. The peasants listened quietly, unsure if it was true or just another tale carried on the wind. But then, it came closer. One day, a neighbor didn't come to the fields. Another stayed in bed, coughing and burning with fever. Then more. A strange black swelling grew on the skin under the arms, at the neck. The priest began to visit homes more often, holding a small cross in trembling hands. The graveyard grew crowded. People spoke in whispers. Some cried, others said nothing at all. It was called the pestilence. Today, we call it the Black Death. There were no doctors, no medicine, just prayers, herbs, and fear. Doors were shut. The roads grew quiet. Families stayed close to their homes, hoping the sickness would pass them by. But it did not. Sometimes it took a child, sometimes a mother and father together. Sometimes a whole cottage was left empty. The church bell rang more often now, not for weddings or feasts, but for burials. Even the priests could not keep up. Masses were short, graves were shallow, and still the fields needed tending, the animals needed feeding. Life, somehow, kept moving. The village felt smaller, quieter. Time slowed down. Each cough made hearts beat faster. Each day without sickness felt like a gift. And yet, even in this dark time, there were signs of kindness. A neighbor left bread at a sick man's door. A child lit a candle for the lost. A widow fed a stray dog when she had little food herself. The pestilence did not last forever, but the memory of it never truly left. When the pestilence finally passed, it did not leave with noise or flames. It simply faded like a shadow at dusk. But it left behind empty homes, quiet fields, and memories too heavy for words. Some cottages were shuttered, their hearths cold. Whole families were gone. The churchyard was full, the ground uneven from hurried burials. The village felt different, smaller, slower, quieter. Those who survived did not speak of the past often. There were no grand speeches, no songs of survival, just long silences, soft tears, and steady hands returning to old tasks. Fields had gone untended, tools rusted from disuse. The rhythm of life had been broken, and now it needed to begin again. So they started small. A garden weeded, a door repaired, a loaf of bread baked in the early light. Children, fewer in number, played again in the lanes. Laughter returned, shy at first, like a bird unsure if it should land. There was grief, yes, but also a strange new space, fewer mouths to feed, more land to plant. Some peasants were given larger plots. Some gained freedom they had never dreamed of. The world had changed, and with it, their place in it. They still worked. They still prayed. But something had shifted. They had seen death, and yet they had lived. And so they planted again. They raised barns. They married. They sang old songs and told new stories. Not to forget, but to remember differently, to remember that life, even when shaken, continues. The seasons kept turning. Spring came again. Wildflowers pushed up through old graves. Wheat bent gently in the breeze. The village would never be the same. But it would go on, and in the quiet space after loss, hope quietly made its home again. Even in times of sorrow, one thing never changed: the Lord's tax. No matter the season, the sickness, or the hunger, the tax was due. It came with no sympathy and no delay. Whether the harvest had been good or poor, whether your family had grown or shrunk, the obligation remained. Each peasant owed a portion of what they produced: grain, eggs, wool, or labor. Sometimes even hens, or jars of honey. If you had a pig, part of it might be given. If you brewed ale, the Lord might take a share. It wasn't always fair, but it was expected. Some paid in coin, though few peasants ever saw much money. Others paid in kind bundles of hay, baskets of beans, lengths of woven cloth. Everything was counted, everything was weighed. And always there was the steward standing at the edge of the manor yard, writing down each name, each payment, each debt. If you didn't have enough, you borrowed. You might trade a blanket or promise extra labor. A neighbor might help you this year, and you'd repay the kindness the next. But if the tax wasn't met, punishments followed. A goat taken, a patch of land lost. Still, most paid without complaint. Not because they loved the system, but because it was life. It had always been this way. And yet, after the plague, something changed. There were fewer workers now, fewer hands to harvest. Suddenly, the peasants were worth more. Some began to bargain. Others simply walked away, leaving the manor to find better work elsewhere. The balance had shifted. But for many, the tax remained a heavy burden carried with quiet strength. And as the sun set behind the manor house, the peasants returned home tired, a little lighter in goods, but still standing, still moving forward. In a village with no doctors, healing came from the earth and from the quiet wisdom passed from one generation to the next. There were no hospitals, no medicines in bottles. Instead, there were herbs gathered by careful hands, leaves crushed with stones, roots dried and stored in cloth sacks, flowers hung upside down from the cottage beams, waiting to be brewed into teas or pressed into poultices. Each plant had a purpose: willow bark for aches, nettle for tired blood, lavender to help with sleep, garlic for fevers, elderflower to ease the cough, The women, especially the older ones, knew these things, not from books, but from watching their mothers and grandmothers before them. They were called wise women, not because they held titles, but because they held knowledge. When someone fell ill, the village didn't rush. They responded with stillness, a warm bed, a cloth for the forehead, a spoon of broth stirred with thyme, a prayer whispered over the sick one's head. Sometimes the herbs worked. The fever broke, the cough eased, a child smiled again, and other times they didn't. But always care was given, with soft hands, with patience, with hope. There were also beliefs, charms, and superstitions passed down like stories. A silver coin under the pillow, a sprig of rosemary over the door. People didn't know what caused sickness, but they did what they could to keep it away. And in the evenings, while the fire glowed low, someone might crush a bit of mint into warm water, sip it slowly and sigh. A simple comfort, a small relief. Healing wasn't about cures. It was about tending, watching, and waiting. And sometimes, just sitting beside someone in silence was the most powerful medicine of all. Healing wasn't about cures. It was about tending, watching, and waiting. And sometimes, just sitting beside someone in silence was the most powerful medicine of all. Most peasants did not dream of rising high. They did not speak loudly or demand change. But still, in the cracks of everyday life, rebellion quietly stirred. Not with swords or shouting, but with silence, glances, and small acts of resistance. A man might take an extra hour to tend his own crops, even if he was supposed to be working on the Lord's land. A woman might hide an egg or a loaf of bread before the steward came to collect the tithe. A young boy might climb a tree after dark to gather firewood from the manor's forest wood he wasn't allowed to touch. They were not trying to start a revolt. They were trying to survive. The rules were clear, the taxes were heavy, the expectations were high, but the people were tired and clever. They knew how to stretch a measure of grain, how to mend a broken tool so the Lord wouldn't need to replace it. They knew when to speak and when to stay quiet. After the plague, some peasants realized the world had shifted. There were fewer of them now. Their labor was more valuable. Some began to ask for wages instead of servitude. Others simply walked away, seeking freedom in towns, far from the manor's watchful eye. And though many remained, something had changed. The peasants began to understand their worth not as rebels, but as people. People with hands that built and harvested. People with minds that noticed unfairness. People with hearts that longed for a little more than survival. Their rebellion was not loud. It was lived. In hidden gardens, in quiet refusals, in whispered prayers for a different tomorrow. And sometimes, the smallest act of defiance was simply choosing to hope. The peasants did not follow clocks or calendars. They followed the seasons, the turning of the earth, the feel of the wind, the length of the shadow on the wall. Spring was the season of hope. Cold earth softened. Buds swelled on bare branches. Lambs were born in the fields. The air smelled of wet grass and fresh rain. Men and women bent low to plant seed oats, barley, beans, placing them gently into the soil. The work was slow and the hands were sore, but hearts were light. The world was waking. Summer was for growth. Long days under a hot sun. Weeds pulled by hand. Fields checked every morning. The crops stood tall and green. Bees hummed. Bread baked faster in the heat. Children splashed in shallow streams, their laughter carrying across the meadows. Then came autumn harvest time, the most important weeks of the year. Grain cut with sickles, apples gathered, onions hung to dry. The whole village worked together, moving like a quiet machine. At night, the barns were full, fires crackled, the smell of baked bread and roasted vegetables filled the air. There was relief, and sometimes even celebration. And finally, winter, a stillness, a waiting. Frost touched every branch. Snow made the thatched roofs look like woolen caps. The days were short, the nights long. Time moved slowly. People stayed close to the hearth, telling stories, sewing, weaving, and listening to the wind. The food was simple stored grain, dried herbs, the last of the root vegetables. Each meal a measure of what remained. And then again spring would return. The seasons taught patience. They taught rhythm. They taught that after hunger comes fullness. After stillness, movement. After cold, warmth. The peasants did not own the land, but they belonged to it, and it carried them quietly through time. As the sun slipped behind the hills, long shadows stretched across the village paths. The air cooled, and the sky turned soft with streaks of pink, gold, and deepening blue. This was nightfall, a time when the day's labor ended and the hearth became the center of life once more. Inside the cottages, fires were stirred to life. Not too high, just enough to warm the room and light the walls with a gentle glow. The smell of smoke and stew filled the air. A pot simmered, perhaps with lentils, onions, or barley. Bread was sliced, sometimes dipped into broth to soften it. The meal was plain, but comforting. Children gathered near their parents. The youngest played with scraps of wool or listened, eyes wide, to softly spoken stories. Old tales of saints, of brave deeds, of clever foxes and foolish kings. Voices were low, words slow, the rhythm of the speech matching the calm of the room. Some worked by firelight mending clothes, sharpening tools, spinning wool into thread. Others simply sat, resting tired feet and hands worn from the day. The dog curled in the corner. A hen clucked once, then settled. The world outside faded into stillness. The fields were silent. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze. No candle was wasted. Only one or two, enough to finish the task at hand. The fire, more than anything, gave comfort. Prayers were whispered, simple, short, and honest. Thanks for the food, safety through the night, blessings for those lost and those still here. And slowly, the family drifted to sleep on straw mattresses under blankets of wool and patched cloth. The fire burned low, the room darkened. Another day was finished. Hard, yes, but shared. And beneath that roof, there was warmth, peace, and rest. Not every day in the village was the same. Now and then, the quiet rhythm of life was stirred by something different. Market day. It didn't happen often, maybe once a week or once a month, depending on the season. But when it did, it brought color, sound, and the scent of faraway things. At dawn, villagers walked or rode carts toward the nearest town. Some traveled miles, their goods packed tightly in sacks or woven baskets. Eggs, cheese, wool, onions, honey, whatever they could spare. The road was slow and often muddy, but there was a sense of excitement in the air. The market square buzzed with life. Stalls made of wood and cloth lined the edges. Voices called out, gently offering bread, spices, candles, fish. There were potters selling bowls, weavers selling cloth, and sometimes even a musician playing a soft tune on a pipe. Coins changed hands, small ones, made of copper or silver. For many peasants, coins were rare. Most trade in the village was done by barter. A dozen eggs for a wool scarf, a loaf of bread for a clay jug. But at the market, coins were needed. Peasants didn't buy much, maybe a new knife, A length of ribbon or a pouch of dried herbs they couldn't grow themselves. Sometimes, just walking through the market was enough to see new faces, hear news from distant places, or taste something sweet and unfamiliar. For a few hours, life felt bigger. Then, as the sun lowered, they packed their carts, counted their coins, and began the slow walk home. Back to the fields, back to the hearth. The market was not grand, but it was a window into a wider world and a reminder that even in the quietest lives there was still connection, trade, and the gentle hum of community. In the quiet of the village, amid fields and firelight, there was room even in a life of labor for love. Peasants did not marry for riches or status. They married for survival, companionship, and sometimes gently, quietly for affection. Two people would notice each other while gathering wood, tending sheep, or walking the path to church. No letters were exchanged, no court dances or secret poems, just glances, soft words, and time. When two hearts decided to join, the families would speak. Land, animals, and small belongings might be discussed. A cow shared, a patch of land passed along, but mostly it was simple. A small agreement, a shared meal, a blessing from the priest. The wedding was not grand. No silks or jewels, just wool tunics brushed clean, hands joined under a village oak or within the cool walls of the stone church. Candles were lit. Vows were spoken softly. A circle of neighbors looked on, smiling, holding flowers or bread. There might be music, a flute, a drum, a fiddle, if someone owned one. There would certainly be food. Flatbread, roasted roots, ale poured into wooden cups, laughter, dances in the dust, a shared blanket beneath the stars. Marriage was not always easy. Life was hard. But love, in its own quiet way, gave strength. Together, a couple raised children. Together, they planted and harvested. Together, they wept when sickness came and rejoiced when it passed. And in the stillness of winter, they sat close by the fire, telling stories, mending clothes, and simply being. There were no portraits painted, no grand poems written, but the love of the peasants was real, worn smooth by time, shaped by work, held by faith, and it endured like the stones of their homes, steady and quiet through all seasons. In time, even the busiest hands grow still. A peasant's life was not marked by riches, fame, or fine stone monuments, but when someone passed, the village paused. Neighbors spoke in softer voices. The church bell rang slow and low. The rhythm of life, just for a moment, became gentler. The body was washed with warm water, wrapped in linen, and laid upon a simple wooden board. The family sat nearby, quietly remembering. There were no long speeches, no loud mourning, just stories told by the fire of planting fields, raising children, healing wounds, sharing bread. The village priest would say prayers over the body. Even if the person had never spoken Latin, the words still offered peace. The coffin, if there was one, was plain and built with care. Sometimes there was only a shroud. The people gathered at the churchyard. The grave was shallow, dug with the same tools used to turn the earth for seed. A wooden cross was placed at the head. No name carved, no dates written, just the memory held in the hearts of those left behind. Afterward, the family returned home. Bread was shared, ale poured, tears were wiped. The fire was stirred. Life quietly, respectfully continued. And yet, the person was not forgotten. Their worn cloak might be passed on, their tools still used in the field, their voice still heard in bedtime stories told to grandchildren, their hands, their laughter, their prayers woven into the walls of the cottage, into the soil of the land, into the very rhythm of the seasons. A peasant's life may not fill books or marble halls, but it mattered. It fed others, it loved quietly, it endured, and in the silence after the bell has stopped ringing, that life humble, hard, and honestus, gently remembered,